Welcome to the Struggle Cast. Thanks for coming in and listening. If you want to listen to some other ones, if you enjoy this, click on some other stuff. But today we're going to talk about, and this could be polarizing, socialism in the South. We're going to be looking at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, pre-World War I, post-World War I, which gave us a lot of bad years between, say, 1911 and 1917, especially as it's related to what our subject matter today. The Red Scare, the Red Summer, how they are inexplicably linked, in my opinion. The history of the socialism and the alternative political movements of that time, of just regular working people, particularly in the South. And then we're going to talk a little bit of pre-World War II, as there was a dominant rise again of worker and labor issues, particularly in the South and all over the nation at that point. But as for our discussion, primarily in the South, particularly on the Delta, the Mississippi Delta, for some of y'all not from around those parts. Then we're going to kind of finish it off with some of the New Deal programs that FDR, as it affected the area that we're talking about, some of the results from that. One particular result that makes me happy on so many levels, but we'll get there. And then the effects of that. And we might even throw in a little fun fact that most people won't know about socialist education, I guess, stemming a socialist college, literally a socialist college that operated for 20 some odd years in western Arkansas, that educated everyone from industrial workers in Arkansas to Jewish laborers in New York. It's an interesting little tidbit, and we'll get to that in a minute. So if you like it, keep listening, and I apologize in advance if it gets a little long. I try to keep these under 30 minutes, and we'll see if we can get there. All right, well, stick with us, and we'll get going. All right, we're going to talk about some unique parts of history. It's got some pretty interesting names that you might know from history, especially early 1900s, moving towards World War I. We've got Eugene Debs and his fingerprints, and we'll get to that here in a second. So we're going to zoom in. We're in the Delta area of East Arkansas right now for our imagination, for our little theater of the mind. Turn of the century, 1901, 1902, early Arkansas. It's quite impoverished. I mean, obviously poverty was everywhere rurally at that time. There was no real infrastructure. It was almost... Again, most of the South and the Midwest was all agrarian, and to a degree, not unlike feudalism to a certain degree, but we'll get to that. So, extreme poverty had plagued this state of Arkansas and was spilling over in it, but there was a hotbed in Arkansas, believe it or not, especially if you look at modern politics. And to think that the socialist movement of America was a hotbed of activity that was educating workers from all over around the country and producing literature and newspapers, and it was being done in Arkansas, of all places. It's just fascinating to me when I ran across this. So let's talk about it. There had been a long dominant the Democratic Party in Arkansas at that point. And there was a fiercely independent spirit of, especially regions of Arkansas are mountainous. And then about a third of that state is all Mississippi Delta, along with the same on the other side of the river, in the Mississippi, the state Mississippi's side of the Delta, the narrow band of Tennessee, north of Memphis, and really starting kind of at the Boot Heel of Missouri, around Blytheville, Arkansas, I guess you would say just south of St. Louis to New Orleans, that whole Delta region. But there was a dissatisfaction of a, the dominant Democratic Party. And I'm not going to try to make any mirrors to modern. I'll let you do that on your own. But there was a huge dissatisfaction with, you know, they're supporting these politicians, especially, you know, we're talking in 1905, 1906, especially. We'll get to that in a second. Because the Socialist Party of Arkansas actually ran candidates for governor in 1908 and in 1918. So, again, counterintuitive from right now. But so there was this fierce cultures in the mountain people and of the planters, the working class of the Delta that, you know, were the laborers. A lot of sharecropping and, you know, pay-to-play type stuff went on at that time. And they had been, you know, supporting these political moves, but we weren't really getting anything out of it. So they started creating their own movements and started to grow all of these independent parties to challenge the two-party system. Again, this is early 1900s in Arkansas. It's just insane. Anyway, the biggest that survived out of those third parties groups were the Socialist Party in Arkansas, which in the western part of the state in Fort Smith, which is famous for where the hanging judge is from, so not exactly a bastion of progressive ideas. Well, it's there that affiliated with United Mine Workers, because you can remember there's still a lot of mining back in that day, from there to New Mexico. And the center of the socialism in Huntingdon and Sebastian County, where they established a Socialist Party newspaper called the Southern Worker. And it was a huge role in the early formation of that party. In fact, one of the newspaper founders, a guy named George Michael or Michael, I don't want to pronounce it wrong, but he was one of the super high leadership positions within the AFL at the time, which is the American Federation of Labor. In fact, I believe he had a whole column in that newspaper just dedicated to the Arkansas Party, and that was published in the AFL's own literature at the time. So the first party convention for the Socialists actually took place in 1903 and called for free and compulsory education, equal rights for women, nationalized health care, and pension programs in 1903. Very interesting. There were 28 groups, mostly in Little Rock in the West, until a rise really took place in the Delta region. They nominated a man named William Penrose, who was a sawmill owner, and he was nominated to be the candidate for governor. He came in fourth, and at the time there was still a wide a prohibitionist party that was looking to, obviously, and eventually did get prohibition going in this country. So they fell to fourth in that election, and that was in 1908. So, anyway, back onto the timeline. By the early 1906-ish, there was a split between the AFL and the industrial workers. And, you know, I think in history they teach it as the Wobblies, and they try to paint them as being a little bit more radical. And so the Socialist Party in Arkansas was more of the wobbly, so they lost a lot of their support from the AFL. And as that party, that representation started to move away from the mining aspect and more into the farmers, it started to getting way more gains in membership, particularly in the eastern part of the state, is a huge hotbed for agriculture, and even to this day, huge amounts of cotton, soybean, and rice are produced in that area, that probably almost unrivaled many places on the planet right now. So very important, and very, at that time, we're talking pre-technology, agriculture was good business, and that was some fertile land. It represents a lot of money, right? So as they got more and more farmer friendly, it got bigger. They started getting together, they started organizing, and they started coming up with more and more candidates, including Independence County, which is in kind of the northeast, almost north central, but just east of north central Arkansas, which is kind of as you move, it's kind of the lowlands that move into the kind of like the Midland Highland area as you get into the Ozarks. And if you go the other way in the county, it levels out and is the beginning. So it's kind of like the gateway to the mountains on one side and the gateway to the Delta on the other. So it had gained some prominence because they had a group that nominated full slated candidates all the way up through 1906 through the 20s. So now we're going to flash forward. The rise of socialism really started in the early 1900s, particularly, and got so strong in Arkansas because of the rural and poor population. With that going up, you also got to remember that with the rise of women's suffrage and the prohibitionists, they were giving rise to a huge voice of the socialist workers, and I would say more progressive leaning. Because again, it's hard to take it because so much of this nomenclature and the contextual words that we're using now are taken completely different than the intent that they were used then, if that makes sense. A lot of things have, pre-Cold War, communism wasn't necessarily a person or whatever. It was a political and a philosophical thing. Same with socialism, republicanism, etc. What we do academically get lost, in 2022, looking back at 1902, using the same, words mean different things, than as to now. So keep that in mind. However, so the suffragists, they're really inserting this dynamic of leftist progressivism into the political structure, into the media. And as women were fighting for the vote, there was also, again, quite successful, the prohibitionists that were also using morality and other things. Now, what's interesting is you do have kind of a melding of the two that I don't think happens much now, but where the morality of the prohibitionist and even the suffragists was cast as a moral thing that you would do, especially, the United States has always been more of the Judeo-Christian philosophy, so to have those elements on board pushing into it as well was quite unique. So we have that working for us. Now, as we go forward, they're pushing this into the element, more and more organizing of the working class. And as we were talking, we left off, we're on the Delta, where there's a lot of working people. And their organization and fight for, at the time, equal rights, wages, etc., it had kind of reached its peak going into, say, around the 1915, as we were gearing up as a nation to go to World War One. We have some interesting things that happen. 1917, I would really say, there's always that argument. They're like, what's the worst year in history? I do believe 1915 to 1917, there can be a really hell of an argument made. As these working people, African American, white, all the affected groups, particularly in this region, were coalescing together behind this socialist idea of, trying to get, especially the tenant farmers and sharecroppers, getting fair, market value for what they had. Well, in 1917, there was a lot going on. Obviously World War One, and at least in our involvement, the Bolshevik Revolution took place in Russia. It was also the outbreak of the Spanish flu pandemic. And that was the first major Red Scare followed in 1919, which to me led to some awful things. So In the pursuit of looking for all of this justice, what happened was a lot of people went to war. It that first scare, other than I would say, especially working through the already established, print forms in Arkansas, which it did, because there was like an anti-Bolshevism act, I believe, that was passed also in 1918 nationally, or 1919. You started to you people were fascinated with it. And again, we're talking in that first 15 years of the 1900s, massive upswelling of these socialist groups getting together, unionization taking place for labor, which all went hand in hand. You also had, at this point, African Americans moving into the labor force, especially after the industrialization of the 1880s, 1890s. It took a while to get to the South, like everything generally does. So by the early 1900s, there's starting to be some integration into the workforce. And when I say integration, I don't mean in the modern interpretation. I mean that there were African Americans in a marketplace, selling their wares and goods, etc. And so at this point, World War One did something interesting. And I'm going to read here, just to put it into people's understand that the Red Scare and the Red Summer, which we're leading to, how they're inexplicably linked. In World War One, just like in a lot of wars, usually lower income, and that unfortunately in America has almost always been minorities as well. Well, always has been. I mean, there's no, it is what it is. And so there are the ones that go to war. So we were still an incredibly segregated and racist society, And so, they were already, and again, we're talking about the Wilson administration, and these are, you can go read the history. I mean, these are not exactly progressive people in thought and deed. But I'm also unfairly judging from a 2022 mindset. So, however, it is what it is. So, after once the Red Scare started, well, World War One was coming to an end. And so, say the end of 1918, you had a bunch of men coming back, and you had a lot of African American black men coming back that were black, African American soldiers and black soldiers that fought, right? So I'm going to quote here, let me see, from the Chicago Daily News in 1918, I believe it was. Quote, returning black veterans are now new men, and world men, and their possibilities for direction, guidance, honest use, and power are limitless. Only they must be instructed and led. They have awakened, but they have not yet the complete conception for what they have awakened to. And in fact, W. Du Bois and the NAACP saw an opportunity. And there was an organization, right? Unfortunately, this is where the two intertwine on that horrifically violent Venn diagram. 1919, we began the riots and the beginnings of the Red Summer. In April, Georgia, it was the riot of Jenkins County. 6 deaths, destruction of property, there was arson, a church, and 3 black Masonic lodges burned down outside in Millen, Georgia. The next month, less than a month later, May 10th, there was a Charleston riot. Injury of 5 white and 18 black men, and the death of 3 others. Following the riot, Charleston imposed martial law, and a naval investigation found that the U.S. sailors and 1 civilian, all white men, initiated the riot. Things are starting to pick up progressively. Early July, a race riot kicked off in Longview, Texas. It led to the deaths of at least 4 men and destroyed all of the African American housing district in the entire town. And I say at least because, and we'll get to that as we get closer to the events that tie the Delta together. It's almost impossible to know if more, and quite possibly more, did die. We just don't know. But July 3rd, again, right on top of the Longview in Bisbee, Arizona, there was a famous company of the 10th U.S. Cavalry, you may know as the Buffalo Soldiers. Well, they were formed in 1866, and they were actually coming through the town of Bisbee. Again, we're talking, July 3rd, 1919, and they were attacked by the police of Bisbee. A week and a half later, the Garfield Park riot took place in Indianapolis. Gunfire breaks out, and that would be the earliest. Well, that transitions quick into July 19th and 23rd in Washington, D.C. and Norfolk, Virginia. There were 4 days of mob violence against all black individuals and businesses, and it was all done by whites. Many who showed up in their military uniforms in all three services, and it all began over a supposed arrest of a black man for a rape of a white woman. Hey, that's a reoccurring theme in America, right? Men rioted, randomly just beat black people off the street, pulled people off streetcars, etc. The police refused to intervene. The black population fought back, obviously outgunned, feigning the violence. Woodrow Wilson sent in the National Guard to do a quote cleanup operation and end it all. By the time it's over, 15 people dead. 10 of them, 10 white people, 2 police officers, 5 black people, 50 people seriously wounded, another 100 or less severely wounded. And the NAACP sent this telegram to to protest President Woodrow Wilson. And quote, "The shame put upon the country by the mobs, including United States soldiers, sailors, and Marines, which have assaulted innocent and unoffending Negroes in the national capital. Men in uniform have attacked Negroes on the streets, pulled from the streetcars, and beat them. Crowds are reported to have directed attacks against any passing Negro. The effect of such riots in the national capital upon race antagonism will be the increased bitterness and danger of outbreaks elsewhere." The danger of outbreaks elsewhere. 4 days later, the Chicago riots. Beginning on the 27th, largest massacre of the summer along Chicago's beaches, Lake Michigan, and they were normally segregated by custom. A young man named Eugene Williams, a black man, young man, child, he swam accidentally into the South Side. He was stoned and then drowned. The police refused to do anything about it. Then young men rioted, and that was it. White mobs came together and destroyed them. Hundreds of homes, businesses on the south side of Chicago just completely done. They called in a militia of reinforcements through the government that, you had 1,000 black families left homeless. It's just insane. So most of these actions were being taken due to no equity and no stakes, right? Especially in this part of history. Because a lot of these areas were of the African Americans that had migrated north, right, and to these cities, and that was the first areas of the backlash. Now we're going to zoom back down to Arkansas real quick. Riots went on continued to go on and culminated, unfortunately, in the Elaine Massacre. The Elaine Massacre was in Elaine, Arkansas. And the reason I'm telling you this story, as I'm telling you the story of socialism in the South, which is at this point of the South, we're talking about specifically in the Delta. And I've been giving you backstory on how there could have been such a rise and influx in this progressive thought at that time. And now we're going to get into the real world of what happens. So, socialism and unionization and labor had really taken off. And now you have these men come home from the war. They're men of the world now. They realize that they're getting screwed. And there's got to be a way to do something about that. Here comes in Elaine, Arkansas, these black farmers got together and realized they were being screwed. They organized, and they wanted to get together so that they could negotiate their prices better and do better for their families, right? Well, how this all starts to go wrong, right, is when they get together and, start putting, they start asking for more money, it was insane. The response wasn't, let's negotiate, or that kicked off the Elaine massacre, where those men, their families, the tenant farmers that worked there, the leadership of that community was decimated, murdered beyond any measure. I mean, it cannot be understated the horrific atrocities that took place in Elaine. And if you do want to see a news report about it or anything like that, there are plenty. I can link some to the bottom if you want to get a taste of it. Which leads us, the more famous parts of the Red Summer are obviously, we get into talking about the Tulsa race riots, Black Wall Street. These were giant upheavals of people. And we're talking pre-social media, pre-any of it. When the white minority, by the way, of Elaine, Arkansas, was their reaction to the organization of black labor, sharecroppers, and the fear that these socialists were going to upend them and take away the planters' land and have to actually share and pay the workers and to let them have some power in the negotiation of their pay. A lot of people don't realize you didn't even get to decide what your crops were worth. Anyway, the frustration with that and the unimaginable racism and segregation that was taking into place, they started the sharecroppers union. Well, planters opposed that, and started to disrupt the meetings. It was called the Progressive Farmers and Household Union of America. And what's crazy is in modern world, they don't really teach that connection. They would rather focus on the racial component alone. And I think that has to do, again, with political and power structures, where if groups of people were taught that it was a little bit more complex than purely race, that somehow race and economics are tied together, that is some sort of a threat to the existing establishment. And that's a really good example of how those two things come in together. Well, in a confrontation at this disrupting of their union meeting, a white man was fatally shot and another was wounded. In self-defense, but we're not going to get what happened immediately on top of that is the planters formed their militia, and they took off to, quote-unquote, arrest the African-American farmers. What happened, though, was hundreds of white people from all over came into the region. A literal mob started attacking the residents. For 2 days, randomly, black people were beaten and murdered on the streets of Elaine for 2 solid days. We don't even have the actual death count. They're all estimates. The estimate is at least up to 230 black residents of Elaine murdered in the Elaine massacre on September 30th. But wait, it gets worse. Sorry, I had to add a little levity. It's pretty deep shit, right? So the government appointed a committee to figure out what was going on. Well, the committee was 7 prominent local white businessmen, and they concluded that these black men were involved in a sharecropper union, which is a socialist enterprise established for the purpose of banding Negroes together for the killing of white people. And it was published everywhere. I mean, even the Dallas Morning News was headlined, "Negroes seized in Arkansas riots confess to widespread plot. Planned massacre of whites today," end quote. And there it is. We got the justification. So the local government, after up to 300 or more black people in the community were murdered, they still tried 79 people, all convicted by white juries, 12 sentenced to death for murder, and then it disenfranchised people to get out of the area. They couldn't vote, they couldn't serve on the jury, and they couldn't defend themselves. Insane. Now, eventually, 6 defendants did make it to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they obviously were reversed due to the failure of the court to produce a due process. They didn't say it was awful, it just didn't follow process, right? That's horrific in itself. So, this was also the case that heightened federal oversight of defendants' rights, which at least, thank God, came. Now, the rioting and, again, I said, the Red Summer didn't end there. Again, Tulsa in itself is worthy of 2-hour-long discussions, 5-hour-long, 6-year discussions about what had happened and the impacts thereafter. But for the nature of this program, we're going to go back and we're going to recognize how awful 1917 to 1919, particularly culminating in the Red Summer, was. And we're going to move on. Now we're post-World War I. All right. Thank you for sticking with me. I know this one's getting long. But now, post-World War I, it's after the Red Scare, we see the Depression. We see hard times, which the residents of the world that we're talking about for this conversation, they had already known hard times. They've known hard times a long, long time. So this is nothing new. So there was, in the just a few years after the culmination of all this violence in 1919, by the early 20s, you started getting a new round of progressivism. If there's anything to be said that was maybe positive about the Red Summer, was an awakening collectively of a lot of people that, there's something really, really immoral and just wrong happening. What can I do? And especially as at this point, as the economy was starting to sour, we're still on the tail end of the Gilded Age, where there was so much excess for the elite class. Again, I'm not trying to mirror today, but there's obvious parallels. And then the vast majority of everybody else is working in support of those people's lifestyles. So there was a rise, culminating obviously in FDR's New Deal that was on the horizon to combat just the brutality and horrors of the Depression, and be able to put people to work. There, you can't understate how bad it was. And again, we're talking coming off of the Red Summer, a pandemic, a world war, and then an absolute catastrophic collapse with the Dust Bowl, leading into the Depression, heightened world tension, obviously, because we are now leading up to World War II. The drum beats of war started almost immediately, as they always seem to do historically, as we see now. But so the rise in the early 1920s is pretty interesting because, of all places, in rural Arkansas, a socialist college was founded. Very interesting, to say the least. Commonwealth College. It was a radical experience in socialist education, and it literally trained and graduated over 1,500 worker and activists and advocates, before becoming one of the first casualties of the later Red Scare of the 1940s and 50s. So I'm going to give you a little story on this just to try to say the rise of it. Again, Arkansas and that part of the world, whether it was, on the side of the river, it was Arkansas, the side that's Tennessee, Mississippi, or even up past Butone, Missouri, down into Louisiana. These regions weren't getting necessarily better for the working class. They were still suffering a lot of inequity and poverty. In response to a lot of these issues, the college opened up in the 1920s, and in the Ouachita Mountains, which is interesting, in the western part, if you were in Arkansas, you'd say more of the hillbilly part than the planter part on the east and the Delta. But throughout its existence, there was over 1,500 students. There were Jewish New York industrial workers, Arkansas sharecroppers. It produced labor organizers. What's crazy is some of the folk singer dynamic that gets in it. As somebody that loves music, you think right after this, you've got Woody Guthrie and Seeger and which all leave on later, to your Bob Dylans and later into the folk, the rise of the folk in the late 50s and early 60s. And most of the people that had gotten an education there, no matter what they went into, mostly went back and organized within their own communities. And it has its roots in, the movements by Eugene Debs. So, but the real strength behind this endeavor was a woman named Kate Richards O'Hare. This lady was amazing. She became the face of the party then. They'd go around like on a tour in small places and give speeches and to other workers, particularly in the Midwest. They were both from Iowa originally. But anyway, they went around and wanted to work with common folks and work for the Commonwealth. And literally, listen to this quote. This is Kate O'Hare. We're talking in the 1920s, right? See if this doesn't hold true till this moment. Quote, "We cannot use and do not want the selfish, white-handed culture of the old college that sought to divide man into two castes." Bars. That's the thing that's, it's just crazy to me. Which not only was the college wonderful progressivism for a very rural, impoverished South, and this is even more, again, when I said it was a hotbed of radical ideas, not just the college, not just pre-Red Summer, which, again, ended horribly. They didn't give up. by the 20s, they had reorganized, gotten as powerful as ever, and then there were tons of worker newspapers being published in Arkansas. And in fact, two of the most famous of the era were done in Arkansas. One in Paragould, called the Call to Action, and then the Greene County Socialist. And they reached a lot of people. In fact, and it's amazing when you go back. We're talking 10, 15 odd years ago. I'm going to read you a little piece that I found that was very interesting, taken from the Call to Action. It was published March 27th, 1912. Okay, we, the Socialists of Paragould, assert our allegiance to the principles of international socialism, as expressed in this written platform. All right, listen to this. Recognizing the antagonism existing between the economic interest of the working class and of that of the capitalist class, and recognizing also the fact that the political parties are but business agents of the political field of economic classes, we, therefore, make our appeal directly to the working class of Paragould to capture the governmental powers of the cities and administer them in the interest of the workers. It's just crazy that this was going on in a time when it's almost unbelievable that the people were so self-aware of what was going on, and very, very cognizant of what it really meant, and that the only way at this point in this horrific time of poverty and inequity was uniting together, because obviously the elite class of that era was not going to help them, and every time they'd been met with just abject violence, right? Which is, in its own horrific. So these papers were here, and I mean, were really giving it the business. I mean, they keeping it, and it stayed in. Now, what's important about this is you have to remember that we have this calamity happening at the time. As we were building up later into the 20s, particularly in the early 30s, in the Depression, FDR came along, and we got the New Deal. And what's interesting is, FDR is generally, and the New Deal is kind of sometimes held up as like the great socialist experiments, and there were a lot of them, and I would urge you to look into them. There's some fascinating socialist experiments that were done in the 30s, as far as like settling parts of Alaska. A lot of people don't realize that there's some amazing agriculture that goes on there, where the U.S. government actually moved whole families, and put them up on farms to get that going there, up to, socialist run colonies. When it came to the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, and a lot of people, to me, this will be a separate arc and cast some other time about the CCC, but the amazing work by the CCC and the New Deal, and making our state parks and building the infrastructure that, came to Arkansas. And at this time, as there were all kinds of factors organizing, kind of like a perfect storm, almost like today, where you have by the late 1920s, in the area where, again, we're talking about was a hotbed of literature and activism, and before that, historical violence through this organization, it had gotten bad. We'd had a drought and floods repeatedly processed over the 20s. In fact, we had a great flood, I think it was the Great Flood of 27, and then a drought that lasted from 29 through 31, and then another flood in 37, which destroyed the schools and the roads, right? So not only do you have all these economic pressures of not having money in your wallet, not having really any control over your work or your life, because again, it wasn't so, it's still not easy for people in certain areas that have means you can't just pick up and leave because you don't have where do you go to and what do you go with, and unfortunately that's been going on in the same areas of this country for well over 150 years now. So, but with FDR, there were some new benefits. They had adopted, not enough credit given to the suffrage movement, the prohibitionists, the rise of the early workers' unions and labor movements that led through, and they paid a price for it, particularly the African Americans and immigrants along the East Coast and African Americans in the South paid in blood, legit paid in blood for these ideas to get into the modern consciousness, which did make it into FDR's administration. Then you add in the fact that the schools were going to crap. The roads were all destroyed. There was no infrastructure. There was no way to get it back, and it was still almost this feudal. It's like, people think the Old South died at the end of the Civil War. I mean, it I don't think it happened instantaneously, obviously, right? So, but when the progressive movement that really was helped established in Arkansas and on that border in the Delta helped move the needle enough, and with labor movements in the East with the industrialized workers and the farm workers of the Midwest, you got that into the popular narrative, right? So even the president and at that time Congress, in fear of not being seen as populist and with the people, because again these were elitists that were very much like today rich people overseeing the majority of people doing really bad due to the depression, et cetera, financial woes. We were in a pretty calamitous state, so to speak. Well, hello, bird. So immediate improvements with FDR and the New Deal is all of a sudden generations of children in Arkansas that were once, this bird is chirping, the children that were once precluded from an education were getting the education. If you were, say, a small tenant farmer, and we'll get to the colonies, but say you're on one of these socialized colonies where you got a little piece of land and you could put your own stuff to market. Well, now you had a road system that was you could actually get your stuff to market. There were medical clinics being put in, prison reform, which is huge and is often overlooked, that, pre-New Deal, the plantation and the prison, that never really changed. And that is another arc and cast some other time that kind of still remnants of still plague 2022, but that's another story. But not only the prison war, there were state services offered now because it was being federally funded that could not. Well, when World War II came along, and obviously post World War II, we got into the Cold War, that pretty much destroyed, as a coordinated effort by our own government and self-preservation of capitalism, that was quashed. All of a sudden, communist went from a political ideal, and I'm not even a communist. I just want a full disclosure. I'm not a communist. I'm not a socialist. I'm still maybe wavering in between things. However, to conflate the idea of a political thought experiment and ideology is not a thing, an identity, whatever, and it was successfully made into that, to where anything that wasn't pure capital democracy was seen as a threat to this nation for whatever reason, societally, culturally, otherwise. Which, let's be real, it's about the money, right? So through the New Deal, we got that. And I only bring that up because one of the New Deal programs and FEMA, the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, as it was called at the time, and the Works Progress Administration, let's talk about some of the successes of socialism now that we're into the New Deal, which should be marked down if I didn't say number one success. paid for by the blood of all those that came before them, and the sweat and the hard work, to get people out of poverty and away from the island of just abject poverty, and a lack of opportunity. So always moving the needle. And I tried to explain to somebody, it seems historically, progression is a game of inches. Regression is, football field lengths at a time. And that's, why you shouldn't give up, keep grinding, do the right things, and hopefully, it gets there. But just know progression is the hardest of all things. It's easy to step backwards 10 steps. It's hard to climb an extra, step up the ladder, right? I digress. So now we're going to get into the successes. Again, under the New Deal, there were a lot of successes. And I want to get to my favorite one before we end this, because this is getting a little bit long. And we can maybe go to a part 2 of this at some point. One of my favorite parts that impacted this part of the world that we've been talking about, and there were a ton of great experiments and programs during this time. Again, take a look at Palmer, Alaska, etc. But we're going to talk about the Dias Colony. And it was established in 1934 as a resettlement community, again, to try to take families and basically get them something. Historically impoverished areas, you would be able to get, there was 500 families recruited from all over Arkansas to move to this one colony, right? And there they would actually get a little piece of the land and a house and be able to take their own goods to market, etc. It was a way to lift the average Arkansan out of poverty at that time. Well, the reason not only was it successful and it set up a base and it really changed the lives of these people in a direct way. It's one thing, that's one of the good things about FDR and a lot of these social programs and experiments they did. It wasn't like, oh, here's a check, go change your life. It was, we're going to create this thing, go do this thing. And your life was, incredibly impacted, But I want to get to it. In fact, Eleanor Roosevelt herself visited the Dias Colony and, addressed the people and kind of the idea of what they were doing there, right? And the reason I say this is so important is one of the greatest champions of human rights and civil causes to come was a man born on the Dias Colony, or raised in the Dias Colony, not born there, who moved there and with their kids. A 3-year-old boy went to live there as one of the first colonists. His name was J.R. Cash, and that was it. Later, he decided he'd go ahead. He needed a first name, so he became Johnny Cash. The man in black, the guy that put Bob Dylan on his TV show and got the second pressing of every Beatles record, that was loved, hated, and finally loved again before he left the earth, was a product of that social program. And I'm not saying that it's because of that social program that J.R. Cash became Johnny Cash, the man we know and love in black. But if you ever listen to the Man in Black, it would be hard to think of J.R. not looking back on his childhood and knowing what struggle was. So that's socialism on the Delta in Arkansas. Maybe we'll come back and look at a part 2 here in the future. Trying to pass the day. Don't let your boss hear. Put in your headphones. And on the next one, we'll try to talk about something just as interesting. Y'all be good. If you like them, click one of these other ones, and we'll see you on the next one.